Gesture drawing, the fastest, most effective way to start your image. Even if you consider yourself a photorealist, mastering the gesture technique could be the one habit your work needs to reach the next level. Gesture drawing is especially useful when working from life without the aid of a photo grid or other reference. It puts composition and proportion ahead of detail, and crucially, can save you from having to restart your image halfway through because you made something the wrong size. Gesture drawing trains you to draw from the inside out rather than the outside in. It can help you think of your subject as a 3D object instead of just a flat image. Shut up, cicadas. Sometimes the difference between a great drawing and a mediocre one is forcing yourself to plan the basic composition first before even thinking about the details. So, let's get started. I have here a basic still life of white objects, and I'll begin by quickly adding loose gestural marks in the center of my middle object. Imagine you're drawing a ball of yarn. You'll see I'm starting with very loose, fluid marks, almost as if the pencil were figure skating on the surface. When working with a still life, it's usually easiest to start the gesture in the center of the image and work your way outwards. This helps ensure that you don't run off the page. One of the most common habits among beginner artists is they like to start the image by drawing a small section they find interesting. This is fine if you're drawing from a photo or using a grid, but if you're drawing from life, it will get you into trouble. Say you're drawing a still life with flowers and you begin by rendering a flower at the top of the image and work your way down. If you don't plan out the proportions in the rest of the image first, chances are you'll draw your flower at the wrong size and place. No matter how good it looks, your only way to fix it would be to start over entirely. Remember, we're trying to avoid that. Instead, if we take just a few minutes to plan out the entire drawing, paying special attention to proportions and placement, we can be sure the foundation of the image is solid and begin detailing later with peace of mind. For this demonstration, I will mostly be using a mechanical pencil in order to keep my marks thin and to not interrupt the video with me constantly sharpening. Normally, you should begin your drawings with a lighter graphite, such as 2B or lighter. If you really don't want the gesture to show up in your finished piece, you'll want to use a 2H or lighter. I personally like seeing a few loose lines in the finished image, as it keeps realistic drawings from getting too soft. Every now and then, pause your drawing and study the ratios of your subject. A simple way to do this is to measure the height and width using your fingers or using the pencil as a ruler. Compare them from one object to another and also to those from your reference. Be careful not to press too hard because lighter graphite will scratch the paper more easily and can even tear it. It should feel almost like you're sculpting the objects with yarn or wire. The more marks I lay on the page, the more solid the object starts to feel. This will come in handy later when we apply the shadows, because it's much easier to visualize shading on a three-dimensional object as opposed to a flat image. Also make sure that you're glancing at your subject constantly and not just staring at your paper. The longer you look at your paper, the faster you will forget what your subject actually looks like. Now that I have all three objects blocked in, the next step is to clean up the edges with a kneaded eraser. Kneaded erasers are best because they can be shaped as small as you need and don't leave hard edges like traditional rubber or nylon erasers. This should only take a few moments. Now is the time to double check the outside shape of your objects and make sure they match the still life. Begin marking the edges more clearly using fairly light pressure. If your objects are light, as in this case, you want your outline to be light as well. If you make your edges too dark, they will override the shadows we add later and make the image look flat. Generally, your shadows should always be darker than your outline. If you've done the work of loosely sketching the size of everything first, outlining becomes much easier. With the edges of your shapes cleanly in place, it's time to begin adding shadows and value. I recommend starting with the side opposite to your dominant hand. This helps prevent smudging the paper. Because I'm right-handed, I'll begin my shading with the left object. It's easiest to start in the center of the shadow and work your way outwards. Notice how I'm using the same loose strokes to start the shadows as I did to start the picture. This helps me feel out the shape of the shadow before locking it down with darker values. I recommend starting your shadows like this. When you're confident they're the right shape, you can then start the darkening process using straighter, more controlled marks. When shading on a rounded object, such as this one, try to wrap your straight marks around the surface of the shape. Here again, it helps to imagine you are drawing on a three-dimensional object. As with anything, begin with lighter pressure and lighter graphite until you're confident of the shape you've made. It's much easier to erase a lighter pencil than a dark one, and to erase lighter pressured marks than heavy marks. This should be a very gradual process. Don't rush into the darker values. I usually start my shadows with a 2B and transition to a 4B and 6B when I've blocked in my midtones. Remember, we're not just drawing the shadows, but we must gently fade them into the lighter areas as well. You'll usually spend more time on your midtones than you will on the darkest shadow areas. Don't be afraid to use an 8B or even 9B pencil to render the darkest shadows of your image. This will give the drawing pop and make it readable from the other side of the room. Now is the time to add any small reflective highlights in the image by simply shaping your eraser to a point and dabbing off the graphite. This is the easiest way to apply light reflections. Check to see if too much of the white grain of the paper remains in the shadow areas. If so, this is the only time I recommend using blending. Blending is one of the easiest ways to ruin a drawing. If you use it too soon or too extensively, it muddies the drawing and takes a lot of work to correct. So, as a finishing touch, I will simply use one finger to make just a couple passes over my shadow areas with very light pressure. This helps spread the graphite powder into the grain of the paper. Generally, it's better to use a cloth to do this. The only times to rely more on blending would be very smooth and detailed textures, such as reflections in a glass or details in clouds or water, for which you'd want to use a paper blending stump. And this concludes our gesture drawing demo. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
You have now completed this lesson.